Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Anthony Hinnon. Joining me today is the Center Square's Pennsylvania editor, Kristen Smith. Kristen, you just did a story recently about local farmers in Western Pennsylvania and concerns about soil contamination from the train derailment at East Palestine in February. What can you tell us here?
I was lucky enough to speak with Cliff Wallace, who is the president of the Beaver-Lawrence Farm Bureau. It's one of over 50 chapters throughout Pennsylvania that represent different counties and regions. And of course, Beaver and Lawrence counties are the ones right along the western PA border, just miles from East Palestine. And we're seeing the biggest impacts of this locally. Cliff was kind enough to tell me about what he's been doing with who he calls his friends, his neighbors, former students, because he's been grounded in that community for over 30 years. And he said that in the hours after the controlled burn happened on February 6th, that nearby neighbors were calling him and telling him that they're seeing these plumes of smoke floating up over their land and landing on their crops, and they're, impacting their livestock. And they were really concerned, especially since, as we reported on extensively, there wasn't a lot of focus on what was happening on the Pennsylvania side of the border regarding this accident. Cliff was very understanding of the initial response, saying that, state officials and federal officials had a lot to take care of at the site itself. But as time went on and distrust grew for what Norfolk Southern was doing for the cleanup, Cliff felt like it was time to really spearhead this movement among the farmers on our side of the border to get their soil tested and to really find out how much of the contamination that could have happened from this controlled release, how much of that was reaching over into Pennsylvania. I mean, we're talking about 7 miles out from the burn site is where he's seeing people impacted by this. And so it's something that he felt was very important to do because there is so much hesitancy and concern, not just from these farmers, but all of their customers as well. There are people who are canceling orders from farmers who provide meat and, sell off steer and cows. They're afraid that it's tainted, so they're losing business that way. There's other farmers who are concerned about, can we till our crops? So, how extensive is this damage? So he is really instrumental in being their voice and helping them get reassurance from the DEP and from the EPA about the safety of their land.
And I guess when we're looking at all this testing that's going on, the EPA is monitoring the air around East Palestine. We're seeing testing of groundwater. As far as soil contamination, soil testing, do we know how this is going to show up or what timeline, or is this, how much of this are residents really trusting what they're hearing from state agencies, from federal agencies?
So it seems like residents are more sympathetic and trusting of the State Department of Environmental Protection and the EPA, simply because, as Cliff told me, they just don't trust the lab that Norfolk Southern uses to test soil and to clear, the air, so to speak. Also, as you just alluded to, the ongoing contamination from these chemicals could be years in the making. They can go on, and we may not even detect them right away. It could be months down the line before we start to detect these contaminants in the ground. So the DEP has committed to continuing to be in the region to continue testing, to test anybody's soil and water who asks for it. Obviously, that's going to be an incredible financial lift for the state. Lawmakers are already saying, and Shapiro is also kind of screaming this at the top of his lungs, that Pennsylvania shouldn't have to pay a dime. Our taxpayers shouldn't have to clean up the mess that Norfolk Southern made. It should be investment from the railroad and from the federal government. So far, that seems like that's what's happening. But it's a big question mark how exactly this is going to shake out, because this is not something that we've dealt with on this scale. Train derailments are pretty frequent. In fact, I think Norfolk Southern records around 140 a year. It was the DEP itself that said derailments seem to be built into Norfolk Southern's business model. And so they have one lab that they work with to do all the testing, and the questions about the independence of those results and the validity of those results they're valid, even coming from state officials. So I think that it's going to be a situation of, no matter the cost, Pennsylvania officials have already realized that this is what we need to do. And at least the farmers in the region, Cliff says, are a lot more receptive to that. They've already submitted something like 15 soil samples for testing, and Cliff is very hopeful that whatever the results are, it's going to bring some reassurance to farmers. And if they should show signs of contamination or anything that's worrisome, he's already gotten commitment that they will continue to do more testing. So they're not going to just abandon these people if the first tests show, that there's no clear sign of anything, because this is an ongoing problem and it could be years in the making.
Well, listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com. For Kristen Smith, this is Anthony Hinnon. Please subscribe, and thanks for listening.